Okay, good morning. It is Friday, April 2nd, 9:05 a.m. This is a meeting of Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. This morning, we are picking up a conversation on H108, an act relating to Vermont standards for issuing a Clean Water Act Section 401 certification. So we've only had so far just a very brief bill introduction. We haven't heard as a committee the rationale for really even what's getting accomplished by the bill. So today we'd like to dive in and hear from folks with deep knowledge and a real interest in helping us understand and possibly move this bill forward this year. So with that, I'd like to turn to, let me pause. We have the order on the agenda currently is Mr. Groveman, Mr. Dumont, Mr. Commissioner Walk. I don't know if Commissioner Walk, if your schedule allows you to stay and bat cleanup, or if you as the agency would like to go first.
I'm happy to defer, Mr. Chair. I can be around till a little after 10 o'clock, but I have a hard stop then.
Okay, great. So we'll move right along and make sure that we get to you. Okay, so Mr. Groveman, good morning. Good to see you again.
Yeah.
The
Good
floor
morning.
is
Good
yours.
to see everybody. Yeah,
Can you help us
Mr. Chair.
appreciate H108?
I hope so. We think it's a good bill, and we hope that it gets moved this year. So just for the record, my name is John Groveman. I'm the Policy and Water Program Director for the Vermont Natural Resources Council. And I'm going to be really brief, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jim, because Jim is the brains of this particular operation, as he is of most operations that he's involved with. So, so this is something that Jim and I have worked on for several years. And as Jim will explain, and Jim provided a memo to the committee, which I hope you all have. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, we'll go through what's in the memo and you can read it afterwards. But as the memo lays out, is basically the bill is trying to do two things. One is Jim and I have identified, a potential loophole in our wetlands laws that could potentially be exploited through the 401 process. And that is basically, we want to clarify that wetlands are covered in the water quality standards. As the memo outlines, the Agency of Natural Resources has always interpreted the water quality standards to cover wetlands. And, we think that was the right decision, but we just want to make it clear, and Jim will explain why it's important to make it clear. And then we wanted to add a tool to the toolbox of the state to deal with significant impacts on wetlands from larger projects that trigger the Clean Water Act Section 401 permit. And that's the purpose of the bill. And I'll let Jim explain the details of it and how much you want to go into the 401 process. I don't know how much the committee's familiar with that and what you really want, how much background you need on that, but we can give you as much background as possible. But the last thing I'll say is that, this was a really, I think this is a good example of the legislative process, the committee process working well in the House. The bill started out looking very different, accomplishing the same goals. And through input from the Agency of Natural Resources, other entities that intersect with the 401 water quality certificate process, other interested parties, the bill changed dramatically, but it still accomplishes the same goal. VNRC is really appreciative for the Agency of Natural Resources and the input that they provided and how they reshaped the bill in a way I think that makes it actually work better, and we were drafting the bill to accomplish these goals. And I think A&R pointed out that there was a better way to structure the bill. And I think we got to a point, and I hope Peter will agree, that, we're comfortable with the way the bill is now. And I think hopefully A&R supported the bill as it came out of the House committee. And so I think it was a good example of the committee process really making the introduced bill a better bill. So unless you have questions for me, which I'm happy to take, I'm going to turn it over to Jim for the details.
Any questions for Mr. Groveman? Okay, well, thanks. And ordinarily by now, we would have had Mike O'Grady in to talk to us, but there was scheduling. He was more than double booked. So we had that conversation with council yet. But so just so that you know, Mr. Dumont, that we're not that familiar with the legal bones of this bill.
Good morning. My name is James Dumont. I practice law in some county that Senator Bray is pretty familiar with. Although I haven't really been in my office for about a year. I work out of my home, which is the background here. And on this, in this matter, I'm working on behalf of the NRC. Thanks for that introduction, John, some of which was not true, but we'll leave it at that. Section 401 is part of the Federal Clean Water Act, and it's a unique and surprising part of federal law. Section 401 says that whenever a federal permit is needed for a project that may affect state waters, the applicant has to get a certification from the state that granting the federal permit will be consistent with the state's water quality standards. So it's a federal statute, it's part of the Clean Water Act, that gives the states power to veto on specified grounds any proposed federal permit. It's very unusual. And the EPA has sort of been the champion of 401, and over the last many decades after it was passed, EPA has issued many guidance documents, and consistently over the years, until President Trump was in office, EPA's guidance documents always said, this is really important to protect the waters of the United States, and in particular, to protect the wetlands in each state. And EPA consistently urged every state to adopt regulations that would make it a good fit between 401 and protecting that state's wetlands. When President Trump assumed office, the guidance documents were removed from the EPA website. But I still have them from before then. Now this is really potentially important for Vermont in one critical respect, and that is the Natural Gas Act, which governs construction of interstate gas pipelines, totally preempts state law, the state law of every state in the nation. So if there were an interstate gas pipeline project proposed for Vermont, ANR would have no say whatsoever. The state wetlands rules would not apply. No state laws or rules would apply. The Public Utility Commission would have no jurisdiction. The district commissions would have no jurisdiction. The only exception would be Section 401 because it's not a state law, it's a federal law. And it authorizes every state, as I said, to essentially veto a federal project on specified grounds. And the grounds are, the basis for the rejection has to be protection of water quality in that state. And where John and I have been concerned for several years is that if you looked at the existing water quality regulations in Vermont, it's not really a good fit with wetlands. They don't mention wetlands. And the wording of the water quality standards is frankly pretty inconsistent with wetlands. For example, they say you cannot have waters that are acidic. Well, as I'm sure you all know, many important wetlands are acidic, like peat bogs are acidic. And if it's state law, you can't have acidic waters, then you'd have to get rid of all the peat bogs. So it's really not a good fit. And what needs to happen is the water quality, the state statutes and the regulations need to say, under 401, ANR can look at both streams and ponds on the one hand, and also wetlands. And that's basically what this bill does. And this issue really came to my attention and John's because we've looked at what's happened in some of our neighboring states when gas pipelines have been proposed. New York is the key example. In New York, there was a huge interstate gas pipeline that was proposed, and ANR's equivalent, New York DEC, looked at it and said no, under 401. And it went to the federal court, I think twice, And the federal court said New York was within its rights to say no, because New York had a 401 procedure that required that every applicant had to look at alternatives, had to make a showing that this was the least harmful alternative. And DEC said, this pipeline company didn't make that showing, so we're saying no. And that was upheld by the US Court of Appeals. If the same pipeline had been proposed for Vermont, we would have been in a very difficult situation. The teams of lawyers that these interstate pipeline companies hire are huge, and they've got millions and millions of dollars at stake. And I'm sure the first thing they would have looked at is, hold it, the state water quality standards don't fit for wetlands. They don't even mention wetlands. Those standards are the only authority to deny a water quality certification. So, Judge, why are we here? And this bill, the principal purpose of this bill is to make sure that doesn't happen going forward, so that A&R continues to have a say, even for interstate gas pipeline projects and for anything else that triggers 401 that applies to wetlands. So that's the principal purpose of the bill. The second purpose, also important, is to avoid the situation where A&R says, yes, you're going to harm wetlands. It could be much destruction of wetlands, several acres of wetlands, but in keeping with Army Corps of Engineers practice, we're going to let you buy your way out of it by making a cash donation to Ducks Unlimited or some other mitigation program. This says instead that the secretary has to make a finding that there's no practical alternative. And if there's no finding of no practical alternative, you can't buy your way out of it. The third point I want to make, which was a subject of great concern on the House side, was, would this affect farmers? And I spent some time on that in the memo, and Mr. O'Grady submitted a memo to the House committee, as did Matt Chapman, and Mr. O'Grady and Matt both assured the House that this is going to have no effect on farmers. There are existing exemptions for farms; those are not going to be changed. That's the basics. I hope that was helpful.
Yes. Okay. Let me pause. Any questions for Mr. Dumont? Okay. I have so just in terms of understanding Vermont's position, is it that we've basically not addressed this sooner because we haven't been sort of in the middle of someone trying to get gas from some place to some other place? I shouldn't say gas. And I think the only pipeline I'm aware of is, other than the VGS system, is the pipeline that crosses the northeast corner of the state.
Yes, that's an oil pipeline, not a gas pipeline, but similar issues arise there. However, the Addison natural gas pipeline case almost stepped into this problem because, as you may remember, Senator Bray, for a while, part of the proposal was to connect to Ticonderoga.
Right.
And that would have made it an interstate pipeline. And if that had happened, the PUC would have instantly lost all of its jurisdiction, and A&R would have lost all of its jurisdiction. And we would have been facing this issue. As to waters and wetlands, can A&R still review it under 401? I think A&R could have, clearly for streams, lakes and ponds, but then we would have been dealing with the wetlands problem. And as you'll see, if you look at gas pipeline cases around the country, very often wetlands are the principal impact.
Okay. Well, I do remember there was, I think it was around Moncton and elsewhere, the Army Corps was in to do, the pipeline goes through wetlands, right? So can you say a little more about the current default? Like, what is Army Corps doing compared to what you would recommend that we do instead or in addition to?
Right. Well, the Army Corps has a process, but as the EPA has repeatedly stated to all 50 states, don't rely on the Army Corps. You have your own interests. You have a different constituency. Each state needs to have its own wetland program under 401. So these decisions are not left to the Army Corps of Engineers. As a practical matter, they're good people at the Army Corps of Engineers in my experience in Vermont, but it's not like dealing with the Agency of Natural Resources. To get an Army Corps permit, you go to their office in Essex Junction, and if you're the applicant, your consultants meet with the Army Corps representative. It's a process that they're sitting at a desk and work it out. They may do a site visit together. It's essentially a private process. There's no public input. There's no hearings. There's no opportunity for hearings. The only time you'd ever get a hearing is if you sued the Army Corps and you were in federal court. And it's not an open process. And again, it's not run by the state of Vermont.
Yeah, I would add that they only have two, well, really 1.5 permitting people for the whole state of Vermont for the Army Corps of Engineers. And they rely heavily on these general permits that often, they don't do an individual review unless there are very significant impacts. And then the review is as Jim described it.
Okay. And so for taking the case at hand, Addison Natural Gas Pipeline Project, can you I don't want to be too particular to that project, but that was probably the biggest pipeline conversation we've had in the state for a while. Yeah. So how can you describe how it played out, even though we was A&R through the 401 process able to address the wetlands issues because it was entirely in state?
Right, that's actually a really interesting question. And there's some remarkable facts about that case that really only came to light afterwards. So some of you may have read that in building the pipeline through New Haven, the pipeline company encountered some very big problems, and those are still in front of the PUC. In the permitting phase, in front of A&R, and in front of the PUC, Vermont Gas said, our proposed route does not go through this wetland in New Haven. And A&R's expert, Mr. Sorensen, said, this is not just a regular wetland, this is a rare and irreplaceable natural area, which by definition means it's of great importance as a wetlands. But the folks who lived outside of the wetlands along a paved road or along a road said, we don't want the pipeline going along the road, put it in the wetlands where nobody lives. And Vermont Gas said, great, that way we don't have to deal with opposition by any people. And they went to the PUC and said, we're going to put it through the wetlands, even though A&R said it's a rare and irreplaceable natural area. Well, if this bill had been in effect, and so A&R both gave a wetlands permit and the 401 certification for the project, including that wetlands, because there was no provision in the 401 regulations for Vermont at that time that said you really shouldn't harm wetlands unless there's no practical alternative. So what happened in front of the PUC was Mr. Sorensen had already lost his argument within A&R, to be frank, because A&R had granted the 401 permit to Vermont Gas. So Mr. Sorensen testified in front of the PUC saying, this is a bad idea. Why can't we put it where Vermont Gas originally proposed it, which they said was perfectly feasible. The only problem with it is the people don't want it there. So we're going to put it into this resource that A&R has classified a rare and irreplaceable natural area. And he said, PUC, please don't do that. And the PUC overruled him and went with Vermont Gas' proposal and put in the pipeline in this wetlands, where it turned out the wetlands was so wet that they couldn't construct the pipeline the way they had proposed to the PUC. So this will all come back again. So if this bill had been in effect, Mr. Sorensen could have said to Vermont Gas, let's keep it with your initial proposal because it saves this valuable wetlands. And then there was not just a practical alternative, it had been proven to be a feasible alternative by VGS's own engineers.
Okay. All right. All right. So thank you for that. It's the more we talk about that project, the more complexity. This is like an onion with an infinite number of layers to it. And I don't think that project is entirely behind everybody yet either. All right. So with that, I'd like to turn to, if there are no questions for Mr. Goldman or Mr. Dumont, turn to Commissioner Walk.
Good morning. For the record, my name is Peter Walk. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. The protections of wetlands in Vermont is something that the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources and specifically the Department of Environmental Conservation take very seriously. I do want to offer a few things that aren't in contrast to what John and Jim have told you, but have offered some additional insight. One, interestingly, I happen to be working in environmental policy at the state of New York at the time that the Constitution Pipeline decision was made, so have some background there as to what the decision made was and why it occurred, but we won't go into that background because it's not really relevant here. We have a slightly different legal interpretation about how much risk there is for the state currently. As both John and Jim mentioned, we have been operating from the perspective that our 401 certifications covers wetlands and includes our wetland rules. So we've been acting in that way, and every 3 years we are required to update our water quality standards. The triennial review, an interesting process whereby not only do we go through rulemaking and through the normal process of rulemaking, we also have to get approval of the EPA. We are in that process now. We'll say the pandemic has put us a little further behind in that process than we'd like, but we're working our way through it and had planned to make clear through that rulemaking process the sort of discrepancy that John and Jim have mentioned and would like to fix via statute. So in some ways we could do this via rule to address that, to ensure that it was clear that 401 covered our wetlands rules were covered in 401, and that's part of the proposal in the language that you see in front of you is directing us to do that via rulemaking, which frankly we appreciate the directive to do a rulemaking to put the detail in place rather than statutory change, especially with this particular rule because of the nature of EPA approval and that sort of strange relationship. Not strange relationship, but different dynamic that exists in other programs. I think, and then ultimately the alternatives analysis piece is the sort of place where I think there is most opportunity for things to go well and things to kind of go off the rails if we don't think it through properly. And I appreciate the thought that's gone into it. It matches in many ways, shape, or form the LEDPA analysis, the least environmentally, can't really remember what the D is, the preferred alternative that the Army Corps process goes through to look at what's feasible, what's practicable, and understands that and gives us the opportunity to incorporate that process through rulemaking. So I appreciate the work that has gone into and the openness of John and Jim to hear feedback from ANR on this bill, so that we can get it to a place where we think it really does and achieves the result that the sponsors intended. So appreciate the opportunity to provide that feedback, and I'm happy to take any questions from the committee. And relative to VGS and the pipeline, I was not around at the time that those permits were issued. But you know, and I'm happy to have one of our wetland ecologists come in and speak to the process of issuing the wetlands permit there. Eric Sorensen, who Jim mentioned, is a Fish and Wildlife employee wasn't involved directly in the wetlands permitting component of that we issued. And so I think it would be useful, if you'd like to hear from that team directly, but I'm happy to, we can do both. But with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay. So just to make sure I understand, does the agency support the bill in its current form?
Well, so I don't, yes, we are supportive of this language because we think it helps to make clear and to make us to create a process that will work. At the beginning of this process, I was not entirely sure that this bill was necessary based on the way our sort of business as usual practice was, but I accepted that there was a desire to provide clarity. So in that way, we can support this language because we took the time to, as John mentioned, to go through the committee process to make it a better outcome.
Okay. And I'm just wondering if any of the witnesses here at this point are saying, okay, you've been through step one, passage from the House over. Are there things that were still open and you feel you'd like to see further adjustments, or at this point, all the parties here at the moment are satisfied with the language we have?
Mr. Chair, we're happy with the language as it is. It was really, we worked it over pretty heavily. We got, just to let you know who had input into it, if you want to hear from them, but Jeff Nelson, and who's a consultant for businesses usually on these type of issues, and I think worked on the Addison gas pipeline project. Warren Coleman, with the main, people from sort of the business side, and then we were able. Their concern, they could speak for themselves, but was making sure that the way their work intersects with current Army Corps of Engineer permitting wouldn't be changed by this. For projects that are smaller, when you look at the bill, when Mike O'Grady walks you through the bill, you'll see the alternatives analysis is triggered by quote unquote significant projects with significant impacts to wetlands. And so it's not intended to apply to small projects with smaller impacts to wetlands, which are covered by the Army Corps of Engineer through their general permitting. And so, we worked hard to adjust those issues. And then I do believe Ryan Patch did testify from the Ag Agency, because especially Representative Smith on the House Natural Resources Committee raised impacts on agriculture, as Jim indicated, but Jim and Matt Chapman and Mike O'Grady, I think, were able to explain how this doesn't change the status quo with regard to how wetlands related to farming are regulated. There was some other, David Mears from Audubon testified in support of the bill, and Jared Carpenter, representing, I think, TU, testified on the bill. But you can get the list from the House, but those were the main people.
Yeah. I participated in a wetlands working group that never got out of the wetlands by the time it was done with its task.
Right. That's a whole other issue that Peter could tell you probably a lot about some other day, but those issues are still out there. And this is really a very specific issue.
Right. Not
trying to deal with all of the issues that we talked about there. And yes, in that group, there was a lot of talk about farming and wetlands. But those issues are still out there, but this bill doesn't address that, but it does at least provide the clarity and create a tool for the state that doesn't exist today.
Okay.
The Senator Bray, and I agree with everything John just said. Appreciate that walkthrough of all the testimony that happened. I think the one area where there was a desire to provide some clarity relative to sort of the process around transportation projects. And it may be useful to hear from VTrans or municipalities, given given that your colleagues in Senate Transportation like to understand anything that's going to impact the transportation world, I would assume that would be useful to have answers there based on. It's difficult for me to kind of walk through all the permutations, not being a transportation project developer, to understand what the issues would be, and we're happy to facilitate some of that conversation if it's helpful.
I can address that now if you'd like.
Sure, we have time, so I might as well keep on working on this. Thank you.
When John and I were meeting with Matt and Pete Laflamme and Warren Coleman and Jeff Nelson and others, Matt raised a concern on behalf of the sister state agency about treading on their established practices at VTrans. And so Matt proposed the language that ended up in the bill, which was that the alternatives analysis would be exempt with regard that state and municipal highway projects would be exempt from alternatives analysis. Not exempt from everything, but the requirement to show that there's no practical alternative does not apply to state and municipal highway projects. And that's for a number of reasons. One of which is those projects often go through alternatives analysis anyway under federal law. So they've already been through it. And another is that those projects tend to be linear projects. And you really don't have a lot of choice about where you're putting it. So I think we all agreed that that was a fair compromise, consistent with the purposes of the scheme, and it wasn't creating a loophole that would be a problem.
You're mentioning a threshold for Army Corps jurisdiction, I think, on smaller projects would stick with the Army Corps. Is that a relatively bright line analysis so that we're not have to run into controversy over whether or not it applies or doesn't apply?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a very bright line. And the applicants that go through it, they know where that line is, and they know when they're covered by the Army Corps permits. And the challenge was just making sure the language didn't affect that existing bright line and, you know, pull those projects into a state process when that wasn't the intent. Again, if you read the language, really, it's significant projects with significant potential for significant impacts to wetlands, which A&R is going to get to define in the rule. And there'll be a rulemaking process, and we think that's appropriate, but it certainly would not be significant, would not equal what the Army Corps is already considering to be, you know, smaller impacts.
Great. You know, since we are running a little ahead, if there aren't more questions about the bill proper, I'd like to check in while we have this very informed group to talk. If you're game for it, I didn't ask people to prepare, but I think in general, this committee has had concerns about loss of wetlands, and we also, and then they're due to primarily, I think, due to development, but then at the same time that we are losing wetlands, we're also, I think, coming to appreciate more and more the critical role they play in helping control and modulate heavy rain events and storms and all the rest. So I don't know if we say, okay, let's just, I'm not going to really assume, but let's assume H108 passes. What would be next on your to-do list for where we might do better on managing wetlands in the state of Vermont? So that's a very free and open question, but while I'm guessing it's of interest to all our guests this morning. So not asking for a program, I'm just asking for context for this committee to be thinking about, probably more for next session, for next January. Sarah McDonald.
When we say manage wetlands, does that mean, I don't know what that means. That means keep our cotton picking hands off wetlands, or what does manage wetlands mean?
That's a It's a great
I
question.
suspect the chair means preserve wetlands.
Yes, yeah.
Protect. I mean, I think it would also be great to get, I know the chair is working to get Mr. Snyder in
Right.
sometime this session to talk to us about some of his overlap and some of this work. It would be great to hear from him too.
So that was a big fat pitch, out there. I don't know if anyone wants to swing,
Right.
but meanwhile, while you're thinking about it, Senator McCormick.
Thanks. Regulatory decisions derive from rules. Rules derive from statute. Statute derives from politics. And if we, the politicians, we deal with the public, with public opinion. You're not supposed to, but we do. And a lot of the public opinion that I hear, that I have to deal with, is from people who think that wetland protection is silly. They're annoyed by, the bar room, the coffee counter wisdom is that the state will stop the project because of a puddle. I mean, I hear that from colleagues, oh, there's a puddle and all of a sudden it's a wetland. Like we're just going off the deep end. Is there like a body of information on what exact, I mean, I'm sure there is, but I mean, I could use prompting, cliff notes, if you will, on just what we do and what we don't do, how much of to rebut the mythology.
Sure, I'll start. In Senator Bray's county, there's a terrific study done on how much the value of the wetlands upstream of Middlebury and the millions and millions of dollars of damage to Middlebury that those wetlands provided during the last big storm we had. I mean, it was an academic study. It was all data driven, and it said Middlebury would have suffered enormous damage if we hadn't had the wetlands upstream along the Otter Creek. It's pure dollars and cents.
Yeah, I could just add, and Peter could speak, I think, obviously from, A&R's wetland program, which I think really the wetland ecologists they have care deeply about wetlands and do work very hard through a difficult process to protect wetlands, which are, Senator McCormick, I mean, I could send you all kind of information. VNRC, the Nature Conservancy, Vermont Audubon and Conservation Law Foundation, we've been working as a group and Lake Champlain Committee for about as long as the wetlands sort of working group has been going on for like 4 years now on strengthening wetland protections in Vermont and educating people about the importance of wetlands. Wetlands, especially with climate change, are one of the most important resources we could protect for the reasons Senator Bray talked about in terms of adaptation and flood control mitigation, stormwater treatment, water quality treatment, as well as healthy soils that could even help sequester carbon. They are really sort of nature's miracle. And one of the reasons we have the water quality problems we do is in Chittenden County related to stormwater is because of all the wetlands we've lost. If you go around Chittenden County and you see the streams that don't meet water quality standards because of stormwater runoff in particular, and farm runoff in some cases, you're going to see that we've developed in wetlands. We've lost approximately since the United States really was developed, when Europeans came over here, we've lost approximately 35% of the wetlands that were here. And so we're starting from way behind. And then that was because obviously there were no rules, right? Back then, people just built what they wanted, and we didn't have a Clean Water Act, and we didn't have state wetlands programs. We've only had those programs for the last 50 years, right? So we're way behind. So I could send you a TNC in particular has some great ecological reports on the importance of wetlands. So I'll send that into Jude, and she could post that, and Senator McCormick, you can see that, and the committee can see it. But I don't think, in fact, I know there's no dispute, certainly between environmental groups and the and the Agency of Natural Resources about how important wetlands are.
Yeah.
And then,
I
yeah.
I
Yeah,
ho-
so
I
I'll
hope
stop
you
there.
know when, I
Yeah.
hope you know when you're talking to me about this, you're preaching to the choir.
Oh, I know that. I know that. I
Okay,
get it.
good.
I
What I was
heard what you
asking
said.
for is
Yeah. Yeah.
what resources are
Yeah.
available for people
Yeah.
like me when dealing
Yeah.
with the guy at the coffee
Sure.
counter.
So I'll send a bunch of links to Jude, or I could send them to your email. And yeah, I mean, there's so much out there because so much has been written. And I'm saying this on the YouTube. So if people want to check, I mean, it's just, I don't think, any scientist who looks at it, wetlands are as important as I said they are. Now, any regulatory, program, people, if you have to be regulated, many people don't like that, and they get into situations, and Peter can speak to that. I think that's been the 4-year effort to make the wetland rules work better. Is that's been, both not lose any protection, and so VNRC and TNC and Audubon and CLF and Lake Champlain Committee, we want to see an efficient program that actually provides more protection, and that's the trick, right? And we'll have that discussion. That's what I meant. This bill doesn't address those issues, and I know Peter is working on some rule changes, which he could, talk about later. But that's going to be the next step in the debate on kind of how do we have an efficient program that's more effective, because I think that's what everybody wants. That's on the Zoom here, at least.
Thanks.
Hey, Commissioner Walk.
Patiently waiting. I have lots to say on this topic. So first and foremost, our wetlands program within the DC is a permitting program, right? Any permitting program is designed to condition the impacts that activities are going to have on a resource, or deny if the impact does not meet the acceptable standards. Therefore, we are constantly in the protection mode, rather than where Senator Bray, you've suggested that we need to be, which is in the expansion of our wetlands, acreage statewide. There is some great work that is going on as part of our clean water efforts that my sister department, Department of Fish and Wildlife, have been leading to really do some great wetland restoration work in areas where there have been previous conversion and there's an opportunity to restore to its previous state to provide those wetlands functions and values. And that really does speak to what John was saying about the opportunity to bring some of that capacity for the value of wetlands back in a way where it's a expansion of where we have been, and a sort of willing opportunity for the landowner to recognize that this resource has more value as its original wetland than what it currently is. Many of those have been on farms along riparian areas where there's a great opportunity, where there's a willing buyer, willing seller relationship with the farmer. Those are great opportunities, and we've really been jumping at those. Jane Lazorchek, who's now stepped into a new position within the agency, managing all of the climate council work, really has been the lead for the last year and a half or so on that effort. And she would be happy to come in to talk to you. I know she's busy with the climate council work now, but this is passion project for her to really make some major investments of state dollars where we know that sort of natural resources activities are really important to in order to sort of address to cost effectively address our water quality concerns. And then relative to the process and the concerns that we hear, I think I probably hear more than you do, Senator McCormick, about the concerns about the regulation of wetlands in the state of Vermont, is that the resource itself does not lend itself to the sort of bright line, clear standards that everybody would love to see as part of a permitting process. Because wetlands by their very nature have blurry edges, the buffers that we place around wetlands are important to ensure that the habitat and other pieces that make the wetland thrive work. And so there is there is a lot of blurred lines and gray area to wetlands that make them difficult for us to administer a wetlands program, a permitting program, and for the applicant who only is going to deal with this once in their lifetime to understand what's required. And so we've been thinking long and hard. As John mentioned, there's been a 4-year process to sort of go through what could be improved in the wetlands rules. We have taken that to what we think is the next step to sort of really put together a solid draft that we're working to finalize now, that we'll bring to the many stakeholders involved in this discussion for some feedback, and then plan to move forward with those rules. But we've also asked those stakeholders to provide us input now for 4 years, and it's time for us to take that and move to make a process that is protective of the resource and provides clarity to the applicants and the public about what the process is and what the expectations are. And while that's challenging, we still, because of the nature of the resource, we need to do it. And that's what we plan to do this spring and summer.
Right. Well, it seems as though there is a complex issue. I think I'm trying to think of who was on that traveling panel for wetlands on the most recent iteration. Senator McDonald has moved his eyes. I believe he was a participant. We traveled around the state, had meetings, and it was one of those. I'm not sure I've ever participated in a process that made so little headway.
We traveled around on lake shores.
I can't believe that's true. I can't believe that's true, Senator Bray.
I don't know.
That's quite a statement.
It was, yeah. So I'm just aware of how hard it is to work on, and
well, that's the nature of wetlands. That's foggy. It sink in up to your knees, and equipment, gets stuck. They're hard to work on. That's why one of the reasons we try and keep work out of it, around it.
Okay, wear your snowshoes when you go in. Well, and a quick question for Commissioner Walk. Is it your sense that there may be the opportunity to, we were talking about acquiring areas and riparian areas, is the interpretation of water quality work broad enough, do you imagine, in ARPA, for instance, that we might be able to include that? I mean, Senator McDonald's often encouraging us to stop fixing problems downstream and get upstream and try to eliminate the problem at the source. I'm just wondering, my understanding is to date, we've had limited budgets to make those acquisitions, and maybe there's an opportunity to make those investments. I also don't know if those investments are basically year-to-year rentals or they're permanent easements.
They're typically permanent easements. I'm happy to have somebody come in and talk about the program. It's a little bit out of my depth.
Okay.
But I would say with the new, especially the money that's come through the Lake Champlain Basin program, thanks to Senator Leahy in the last couple of years, we have really upped the investment there. And so there is significant work going on there frankly, the capacity of the ability to turn those sort of land. I mean, they're all land use deals at their initial stage, and then sort of getting into the work component of it. We have limitations there just based on capacity. As to whether or not this would qualify under ARPA, I guess I would refer to my commentary from yesterday in committee that we don't know what the rules are yet. And so I can't define precisely for you whether or not these would qualify.
Okay, great. Well, I know, for instance, over this way along Otter Creek, there are not only, we have the Lake Champlain TMDL, but we have E. coli TMDLs, and there are fields that flood. Otter Creek, I don't know if this is, I should try to double check this, but I've heard it only drops 6 inches between Rutland and Middlebury, which seems kind of amazing. But even if it's more than that, it's a very slight pitch, and there's a lot of flooding that occurs. When it's farmland, some people like the impact on the quality of the soils that they get flooded routinely, but we also seem to have quite a lot of material ends up leaving farms along the way because of that same flooding. So it seems like there may be candidates over here to take some land out of production that contributes to our E. coli TMDL.
That 6 inches may speak to your previous commentary. Maybe this was before we went live with on the recreational opportunities along the Otter Creek.
Yeah, I mean, you have to paddle. You have to paddle yourself. You can't just
there's not a
float
lot of
downstream.
float.
Right.
Uh,
All right.
Certainly, yeah, certainly there are opportunities. I know that's certainly something we've areas of the state we're keenly interested in. So there's lots of activity. Again, we can go through the sort of details with you if that's helpful. But I think it's, well, I guess what the broader picture I was trying to paint is there are 2 sides to the wetlands picture in Vermont, which is how do we find opportunities to reestablish wetlands where they may previously have been to provide their previous benefit, and then how do we have an effective permitting scheme that ensures that we protect the resource in a way that is sort of reasonable and predictable, and all the things that we like in permitting programs.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you to everyone who on H108 and for a broader conversation. We'll have, in addition to assembling other witnesses, we'll start with Mr. O'Grady giving us a walkthrough in some detail. So, cool. And thanks too for Mr. Dumont for your primer on the bill. So that's helpful as well.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, and please have us back in if there are questions that will inevitably arise when Mr. O'Grady testifies. Jim and I are both available to come in anytime to address the questions from our perspective.
And I will offer up, our team, Matt Chapman, Hannah Smith, Pete LaFlamme, happy to come in and support your inquiry as well.
Okay, so we'll go through Renita and let you know what we're up to. And if you all always want to make sure that we're specific enough in our requests so you know who's a good resource. So if there's any questions, when in doubt, ask us. We'll get more specific. Okay.
We will.
Great.
We will do that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So committee, for today, there's a couple things left. One is Mr. O'Grady had to change his schedule, so we're going to have a break coming up rather than going right to the Bennington groundwater reclassification issue again. He's not available till 11. Let me just double check that with Jude because his schedule has been under duress. Let's just say that. Okay.
That's the latest word I have from him is 11 now.
Okay. So in terms of other kind of housekeeping, we still have.
Are we on live here now? Or?
Yes, we are live.
Yeah. So we'll let's do some just housekeeping notes so people will know what's coming up. I did hear from folks in the composting world that they would like to visit with us and talk about concerns about ANR's implementation of the organic management provisions in the universal recycling law. So I talked to some folks who are, I guess I'd call them folks from the high quality composting world, and they're the concern I heard, so these are organic producers. The concerns their concerns are broader, but I think one of the things that's triggering concern at the moment is the whole depackaging strategy that ends up with a certain amount of packaging in the food slurry or whatever it comes out, when you're done depackaging. And then the packaging of concern is plastic. And now they're seeing that they're getting plastics or microplastics in with the food residuals because of the processing technique being used, or that's the way it was described to me. So, we're always trying to avoid contaminating things. And it seems to be one of the things we struggle with over and over again is how to reduce the amount of contamination of things. So there's that concern. So I will put together a meeting on that one. I think the House is also interested. And then I heard that House Agriculture was also interested. So I'm going to reach out to Senator Starr, and maybe this is natural resources and ag on both sides, and we'll have a hearing and come up to speed on that in a relatively quick way. I don't know if there are any implications in terms of taking action this legislative session, but for now, I just want to let people know we'll take that up. We have Velco in next week. They were they were unavailable this week when we had our round 2 on sort of the energy future and distributed generation in Vermont. Nominally, it was, we were taking up S119, the community energy bill. The backbone of that whole system is the grid, the transmission grid, and they've been working a lot in the last 18 months on their next long range plan. And I've talked with them, and they have a lot of research and a perspective they really want to share with us so that we're aware of opportunities and constraints that they would face as the transmission utility supporting all those distribution utilities, since they are owned by all the distribution utilities. And that's it for the moment.
What's the name?
Okay. All right. Well, there's